welcome everyone.
At number 19 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on National Defense. La réunion d'aujourd'hui se déroule.
Today's meeting will be a hybrid meeting pursuant to the Standing Order of the House adopted January 25th, 2020. There will be members here in person or using the Zoom application. The proceedings will be published on the House of Commons website. For your information, the webcast will be showing the person speaking.
Actually, I would like to outline a few rules to follow. Members may speak in the official language of their choice. Interpretation services are available, but please let me know if we have any challenges with interpretation or technology. Bring that to my attention. For members participating in person, proceed as you usually would when the whole committee is meeting in person in a committee room. When speaking, I'll try and follow my own advice. Speak slowly and clearly, and when you are not speaking, please put your mic on mute. All right, with regard to a speaking list, the committee clerk and I will do the best we can to maintain a consolidated order of speaking for all members, whether they're participating virtually or in person. Please use the raise hand function. That's what the clerks will be using to keep track of whose turn it is to talk next. Pursuant to Standing Order 1064, the committee is meeting today to consider a request received by the clerk and submitted by 4 members of the committee to discuss their requests for additional witnesses for the study of addressing sexual misconduct issues in the Canadian Armed Forces, including the allegations against former Chief of the Defence Staff, Jonathan Vance. And we also have a motion from Mr. Garrison, which has been forwarded to all committee members to consideration. I will now open the floor to debate. Mr. Garrison, you can proceed with your motion. I go ahead.
So, as a point of order, since this was a special meeting called by Conservative members, I believe that we should get the floor first to explain why we want to have the special meeting under 1064, and then we can proceed to moving motions.
Well, I did have the advice of the clerk that says that it doesn't matter one way or the other.
I believe earlier I suggested that I'd like to have the floor first, since when we had discussed this about half an hour ago.
I accepted your request, but Mr. Garrison brought his motion.
Our motions are circulated as well, Madam Chair.
That motion was forwarded to the committee, so we just need to get it on the floor, and then I'll hand it right over to you. I don't think this is going to take very long.
Okay.
Okay? All right, go ahead, Mr. Garrison.
I'm a bit of a loss, Madam Chair, and I thought we were going to have a report from the steering committee to the full committee at the beginning of this. I'm happy to place my motion on the record at this point and yield the floor to Mr. Bazan.
Yeah, you can read this motion.
Okay, could you go ahead and read your motion, Mr. Garrison, please?
Sorry, Madam Chair, just too many papers on one desk. So I have moved that the Standing Committee on National Defence invite the Minister of National Defence to return to the committee and clarify his previous testimony given during his first appearance as part of the study on the allegations of sexual misconduct against the former Chief of Defence Staff. Now that the committee has heard testimony from former National Defence and Canadian Armed Forces Ombudsman, Mr. Gary Walborn, as the former Ombudsman's testimony conflicts with what the Minister disclosed about his meeting of March 2018 with that of Mr. Walborn, the committee requires clarification from the Minister.
Okay. All right. The motion's now on the floor, but go ahead, Mr. Bazan. You can bring your motion to the floor as well.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
No,
and
stop. Do we need to debate this motion? So, all right, this motion is open for debate.
Just clarification, did he table it or did he actually move the motion? That was just notice of motion.
Open for debate. So, is there any debate?
I think he proposed it, sir.
You just gave notice. You just gave notice.
I'm pretty sure he just gave notice of motion.
And yielded his time.
Can I extend what's in the motion, just put it on notice, or just debate?
Mr. Garrison, are you just putting your, what's the,
This motion,
like, are you bringing it forward, or are you just putting it on the, for debate? Or you just wanted to read it into the record?
Okay, Madam Chair. Again, without a report out of the steering committee, I'm a little lost as how to proceed, but I do believe that we have general agreement that the minister should appear and that the minister is willing to appear. So I will move the motion. I don't think it requires a lot of debate at this point, and we can deal with it expeditiously and move on.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else want to go ahead, Mr. Bazan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, suspect on how the meeting opened and the way our last meeting closed. You adjourned the meeting without actually having consent from the committee to adjourn. And there was a point of order that was trying to be raised by Mr. Garrison. So I'd just say this, Madam Chair, that, you know, I support having the minister come back to committee. I support him correcting his previous testimony now that we've heard from Mr. Walborn. I do say, though, to all committee members, I think it is would be more beneficial if the minister waited until we get through some more witnesses that we want to call, especially as we hope to expand the scope of the study to include the allegations of sexual conduct against Admiral MacDonald. And so I think that if we could have him appear after a few other witnesses come forward and we hear that testimony, then, Madam Chair, I think it would be very welcoming to have the minister return.
Yes, and I think that this minister has shown throughout the period that he's been minister that when he's been asked to come to this committee, he has always been very, very happy and willing to come and to testify before committee, to answer the questions. That's something that the minister's always done. I have full confidence that he will do that again. There are a number of things that I believe that the minister would like to get on the record. So this is something I would imagine we would want to do as soon as possible. I also, though, caution that, you know, we do have ongoing investigations. And, you know, as the committee has stated, and I know the opposition members agree, we have to be very careful when we're looking at ongoing investigations. We have to make sure that we don't do anything that could impact a just and fair outcome for any complainants that are coming forward. And the more that we're going back and forth and debating about political witnesses, and I think that, you know, the women who we want to come forward, and we want women to come forward, women and men, it becomes less likely the more that this is politicized. So I think the minister is very happy to come back. I know that he will make himself available whenever this committee would like him to come, and I would imagine that sooner than later would be appropriate. But please, everybody, let's just remember that we don't want to jeopardize any ongoing investigations. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Baker, go ahead.
Thanks very much, Chair. So I mean, I want to echo what Ms. Vandenbelt said in terms of, I think, the minister's willingness to come. You know, I believe he's very willing to come. He's come before, and so I think that's important. I do think that I'm not sure if I understood Mr. Bazan's request that we delay the minister from coming. Maybe there's a rationale that Mr. Bazan could share. It sounds as though Mr. Bazan doesn't want him to come right away. Maybe I misunderstood that. I'm not trying to put words in his mouth, but just trying to understand what the rationale is there. I know that when we heard from, after we heard from Mr. Walburn, in our last meeting, that there was some interest from members on, including the opposition, and hearing from the minister. So just wondering if there's a change there. What our goal is. What Mr. Bazan, what his intentions were when Mr. Bazan suggested that we delay the minister coming.
Okay, can I just interrupt here? Is there anyone who has an objection to Mr. Garrison's motion? Is there? So then it's you. Pardon me?
Call the question.
Call the question. All right. So I don't think anybody's objecting. Is that correct?
I don't see any hands raised.
No. Okay, that's what I thought it would be this simple. Chris, we're good. So we have no one dissents. So we have unanimous consent. So we're adopting the motion. Okay, good. Over to you, Mr. Bazan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Conservative members did request this meeting to ensure that we spent some time to talk about the testimony that was given by Gary Walborn and the developments that have occurred in the past few days in the media. Some more details have come to light. I do agree with Mrs. Van de Belt that we don't want to politically interfere in the investigations. We don't want to taint them, and we really do believe that we want to have a fair process for all the parties that are concerned. However, there is the new allegations that came against Admiral MacDonald that need to be also looked at, and we need to get down to what processes are in place, what didn't happen, why the minister didn't act back in 2018. And so I'm going to move the following committee here, especially as we celebrate International Women's Day, that we have a lot of women in the Canadian Armed Forces who have sworn an oath to protect each and every one of us, and it is our duty as this committee to protect them from sexual harassment in the Canadian Armed Forces. So, and this motion has been circulated to committee, so everybody has it in front of them, that the Standing Committee on National Defence, concerning its study on addressing sexual misconduct issues in the Canadian Armed Forces, including the allegations against former Chief of Defence Staff Jonathan Vance, expand the scope of the study to include the allegations against Admiral Art MacDonald, and that the committee invite the Minister of National Defence alongside the Deputy Minister of National Defence to testify at the earliest opportunity for no less than 2 hours. And that this meeting be held in public and televised, and that should the minister not agree to appear within 14 days of passage of this motion, that the chair be instructed to report to the House requesting that the committee be empowered to compel the minister's appearance from time to time, that the committee summon Lieutenant Commander Raymond Trotter to testify within 5 days of the passage of this motion, that the meeting take place in public and be televised, and that the witness appear for no less than 2 hours, that the witness appear alone, and that the witness be permitted to appear with counsel. And the committee issue a summons to the following witnesses to testify: Zita Estravis and Michael Wernick, and that the witnesses appear no less than 2 hours, that no more than 2 witnesses be scheduled for each meeting, that these meetings be held in public and be televised, and that the witness be called to testify within 14 days of this motion passing, and that the committee invite the following witnesses to testify: Elder Marquias, Janine Sherman, the Assistant Secretary to the Cabinet, Senior Personnel Privy Council Office, and Lieutenant Colonel Retired Bernard Boland. That the witnesses appear no less than 2 hours, and that no more than 2 witnesses be scheduled for each meeting, and that these meetings be held in public and be televised, and that the witnesses be called to testify within 14 days of this motion passing. Now, Madam Chair, if I can speak to the motion, I will just go through here one. Now, I realize that this motion was tabled before we passed Mr. Garrison's motion, but we do need to hear from Deputy Minister Jody Thomas. I do believe that the Minister and the Deputy Minister need to appear for a full 2 hours so that we can have a thorough discussion. And the summons of Lieutenant Commander Raymond Trotter, the reason it needs to be a summons is he's a person that's still in the chain of command. According to reports and news last night by Global, he's already faced intimidation and threats that his career is over. So we want to make sure that he feels free to appear without fear of reprimand, and the only way we can ensure that he can appear is to summon him through a subpoena. Now, we have extended invitations, my understanding, Madam Chair, to both Zita Estravis and Michael Wernick, and that they have declined those invitations. And since we have invited them in the past, that then we should summon them this time, so we can find out what took place in 2018 from the Privy Council office down to the Minister's office, and when Ms. Estravis was the Chief of Staff to Minister Sagen. Then brought to light in news media this past week that Elder Marquez, who was a senior policy person in the Prime Minister's office, was also involved in communications back and forth with the Privy Council office and the Minister's office. We have had Janine Sherman at committee in the study previously. We need to call her back, especially now that there is actually memos going back and forth from her to an unknown person, I'm assuming in the minister's office, as well as a briefing note that was prepared by the Privy Council office because they needed to get things in writing, which actually support the position that former Ombudsman Gary Walborn was not in a position or able to investigate the allegation, one without the approval of the victim who wanted it to remain confidential, and without direction from the Minister of National Defense who he reported to. So, and then we also want to include a retired Lieutenant Colonel Boland, who also has experienced we've got to look at the cover-up that has been done by Minister Sajan and the PCO and the allegations that were brought forward in 2018. We need to look at the timeline that it took from when Mr. Commander Trotter first reported on February the 3rd that there was allegations of sexual misconduct against Vice Admiral, or Admiral Norm, I can call him Vice Admiral, but Admiral MacDonald, and that Admiral MacDonald that then took another 3 weeks before he stepped aside. So we know that there was calls made right into the minister's office, into the deputy minister's office, and still it took another 3 weeks before the Admiral MacDonald had to step aside so that there could be an unobstructed investigation free of chain of command interference. So I'm putting that on the floor and hope that everyone here can support it so we can stand up for the brave women who serve in the Canadian Armed Forces and ensure that they have independent and safe process to come forward with complaints of sexual misconduct.
Okay, Madame Gallant, you next.
I support what Mr. Dan said, and I'm ready for the question to be called.
Madame Vanderbilt.
So I think that this is obviously something that matters very, very much to Canadians. I think we have to keep absolutely the focus on the fact that you have women in the Canadian Armed Forces who are watching what we're doing, and they need to have the comfort to feel that they can come forward. We want anybody who has faced anything like this to feel that they are comfortable to be able to come forward and have the right processes. I think this committee has a significant role to play when it comes to finding what better processes may be there. I know we have another study coming up on the military justice system, which of course allows for us to make recommendations about how we do things better. It is absolutely clear that we have to do things better. Having said that, I know that the what's been alleged in the media that is happening to Mr. Trotter is absolutely unacceptable. We cannot condone anybody, especially someone who's a potential witness to this committee. We cannot condone anybody feeling that they are being intimidated to be able to come to Parliament. So what's been alleged in the House of Commons, I think all members of this committee want to give whatever assurances we can to Mr. Trotter to make sure that he knows that he can testify before this committee freely, as can everybody else. Absolutely, I think that when we have the minister here, I think we will find that there will be a lot of this will be a lot clearer. This is something that I know that the minister is keen to come. I note that there are a number of people here who are listed. I would like to add 2 names just because we do know that General Vance was appointed by the previous government. Most chiefs of defense staff, from the time that they are named publicly to the time that the change of command happens, it's usually just one month. So I'd like to add.
We're discussing this motion.
I'm amending the motion. I'm doing preamble to an amendment to the motion. So I would like to amend the motion so that we can also include some people that could shed light on what happened in the sense there was 3 months between the time that General Vance was named to the time that the change of command. And we've seen in the media that there are actually some allegations that there were things known then. And I think that, you know, if we're going to be looking at how to fix things, we also need to look at where things went wrong. So I would suggest that we would bring, in addition, that we would bring Ray Novak, who was the chief of staff at the time to Prime Minister Harper, and also that we bring Garrett Newalt, who was the chief of staff to the Defense Minister, Jason Kenney. I would like to make a point, though, about a word that we have in this motion, that I think we should change the word summon to the word invite. I can understand the reasoning behind Mr. Trotter, and I think that if that's the case, and the clerk could maybe clarify, if that gives him more ability to speak freely, I would be open to summoning him. I have checked with the Library of Parliament, and in the history of this Defense Committee, there has only been one witness that they could find who has ever been summoned, and that's Mr. Walburn. In the history of Parliament, there have been, in the annotated standing orders, you can only find a handful of names of people who have been summoned to come to speak before Parliament. I was in the Ethics Committee when one of these instances
Point of
happened.
order, Madam Chair. Point of order. I believe you can only make one amendment
Okay, so
at a
I'll make
time.
one
So
amendment
which
and then the
is the
second.
amendment so that we know what we're amending?
Okay, so I would like to amend so that we would first remove the word summons. In the second part, we can keep the word summons for Mr. Trotter, but where it says the committee issue a summons to the following witnesses to testify, I would say that we would invite, and I know that Ms. Estravis was invited. I would say we put in written form an invitation to Ms. Estravis, and that we not include the former clerk of the Privy Council, Michael Wernick, because of health reasons. I think that we would be able to get the answers that we need from having the minister having invited the other lists that you have here. And I would make sure that we be very, very cautious about summoning. As I said, in the history of Parliament, there's been a handful, and usually it's after the invitation was extended 5-6 times. I know in the Ethics Committee, when it was the Facebook Cambridge Analytica issue, there were a local Cambridge Analytica company. We sent five letters, if I'm not mistaken, and they sent letters back with reasons. We debated those reasons in camera. We went back and issued new invitations. Then we sent a letter saying, if we invite you, we will then. I think this is very important to get on the record that the process for summoning someone is a very serious process in this Parliament. And so, what I would suggest here is my amendment. My amendment, the first amendment, and I'll have another one after about additional witnesses. But the first amendment that I have is an amendment that we delete the word summons and we say the committee invites the following to testify, and that we drop Michael Wernick and we just keep Zita Estravis. So in fact, that could even be in the lower part. I'm seeing that it says that the committee invite the following witnesses. So I would take that whole part out and I would just add Zita Estravis to the second part, so that ultimately what we're doing is we are inviting, and we could say invite in writing. I think that's the next escalation in this case, would be to send a written invitation and ask for a response. And then not Michael Wernick. And if the committee wishes to keep the word summons for Mr. Trotter, I would then agree with that. And then, Madam Chair, I'll have another amendment after that.
All right, Mr. Garrison.
Thank you very much.
Please turn off the microphones in the room.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I wanted to speak just generally about Mr. Bazan's motion today before I address the amendment. I don't think it's lost on anyone that this is an International Women's Day, and what we're talking about here is fundamentally the issue of whether women can serve equally in the Canadian Armed Forces. And they can only do so if they're assured that sexual misconduct is not only mistolerated, or not only not tolerated in principle, but also that effective action is taken when there are allegations of sexual misconduct. And so I think that the events that have recently transpired with 2 chiefs of defense staff in a row regarding sexual misconduct raised the question of whether the senior leadership in the military and indeed the defense minister understand what it means to have effective policies against sexual misconduct. Whether those leaders really understand the problem. And secondly, it's very clear that effective action was not taken once allegations had been made. So that, to me, is the essential task of this committee, is to establish the facts of those two things. It's not to intervene in any of these specific allegations or investigations, and I think we've all been quite clear on that. So having said that, in general, I want us to keep our focus there. We have a job to do that does require us to hear from the minister again, and I'm glad we had unanimous agreement to do so. I support the motion from Mr. Bazan to include these witnesses, but I will say that I'm also inclined to support the amendment from Ms. Vandenbeld, which essentially takes out Mr. Warnick for health reasons and makes a written invitation to Ms. Stravis. I think those are good and effective changes to this motion. And so therefore I will support the amendment and then eventually hope to support the main motion. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Bagnall, please.
Thank you. I
Microphone.
Mr. Bazan on the the last speaker that the emphasis needs to be on protecting the women in the military so that they can feel safe. And as I mentioned in the last meeting, I think we need to work on the systems and the problem. And we had a number of academics that mentioned the problems, and we've talked today a bit. It was mentioned already, which was good today, that's about procedures. There's various investigative sources and avenues that people can proceed with, but the exact direction when a call comes into defense, where that should go and how it should go is one thing. But the major thing the academics said was it's the changing of the culture. And I want to make sure we stay on that focus. I'm worried that there's a lot of witnesses. I won't mention them now. I may ask to amend some later, but there's a number of witnesses that I think that could offer a lot more to how we answer the suggestions that the academics made of how we can protect women better. A lot of it's related to culture. It's related to appointing more women to senior positions in the military. And I think that needs to be our focus, is how we can fix these systems, make them independent enough that women feel protected, that all members, but particularly women in the forces, feel protected. So I think there'd be a better witness list or additions to the witness list that would really maintain the focus on that than some of these witnesses are related to a specific case or cases, and which I don't have a problem with, but I think it's far too narrow, and we should be incorporating witnesses that can really deal with the structural problem, the avenue of procedures, to the various legal investigative methods that are routes that are available, and any improvements that need to be made with them, because obviously it's not working. The culture still hasn't been changed, and so we need to come up with an avenue to change that. And so that's going to be my focus during the meetings, is to make sure we sort of stay on that track to protect the women in the military by working on these systems, working on the culture, working on the procedures. I'll leave it at that for now, but I'm hopefully people will propose some of these other witnesses. If not, I can later on, a later intervention. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Bagnall. We have 4 people with their hand raised in this order: Madame Ellslev, Madame Gallant, Mr. Bazan, and then Monsieur Brunel-Duceppe. Over to you, Madame Ellslev.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. This is a very serious situation. And so if we're going to discuss a serious situation, summons is a serious response to a serious situation. So perhaps we need to look at sending an invitation followed by a summons if the invitation is refused, sorry. The culture in the Canadian Forces has witnessed a number of initiatives over the last 30 years, all which have systematically failed. The processes are in place. There are processes that say that this type of behavior is unacceptable and that there are consequences for the unacceptable behavior. What has happened is that people in very senior key positions have failed to follow those processes. It is our responsibility as a defense committee to understand how that failure has occurred and if there are additional checks and balances in terms of processes that need to be put in place to ensure that senior people cannot fail again and fail the members of the Canadian Forces in providing a harassment-free workplace. So my understanding, Madam Chair, is that Mr. Warnick is not the one with a health problem. So perhaps we could have more information on that, because we can't find any record publicly that there is a health issue with Mr. Warnick that would in any way preclude him from appearing. So I think we need to understand if in fact there is a serious enough health issue, because he is, as the former clerk of the Privy Council, an absolutely key person that this committee needs to hear from to understand how the processes were not followed and how this failure was allowed to occur. So we need to understand if there is a health issue with Mr. Warnick, because we believe that if there is not, he needs to appear as a witness. And secondly, that the summons should occur if the invitation by these people that we need to hear from to do our job is refused. Thank you.
All right, Madame Gallant, please.
Regarding the comments from Ms. Vanderbilt, I was surprised that she said that she's quite confident that we could get the answers to our questions from the other witnesses. How would she know what they know? Is she contributing to this whole cover-up? And with respect to Mr. Wernick, is she confusing Mr. Shugart with Mr. Wernick? Again, we're unfamiliar with any situation with respect to health regarding Mr. Wernick, and he was most helpful during the SNC Lavalin issue as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I do want to ensure that if Mr. Warnick's not feeling well, if that's a legitimate excuse for him not to be able to appear, and again, to make sure that we're not confusing Privy Council officers of Mr. Warnick with Mr. Ian Sugar, who we do know is facing some major health challenges, and of course we wish him well in his recovery and that he gets well soon. The I don't have a problem in adding a couple of names. I think that they won't be able to shed a lot of light, but I got to remember I was parliamentary secretary at the time when we did appoint General Vance as CDS. But I think it would be good to do that comparison of how the screening process took place between General Vance and Admiral MacDonald. So where is the flaws, and how do we improve this so that we can get down to appointing commanders of the Canadian Armed Forces that will ultimately be able to inspire their troops when it comes down to the issues like Operation Honor. But we can talk about that appointment process, and I think it's good that we do that on all fronts, because it is important. But I think that the issue and a question for you, Madam Chair, is weren't both Mr. Warnick and Miss Estravis called to committee by a written invitation? And if they already declined that written invitation, or did you pick up the phone and call them? That's the other option. But if there was an actual email or letter that came under your signature or the clerk on your behalf, that's already been a written invitation and they declined it. And that's why the importance of summons is here. Time is up at the essence. The women who serve to protect all of us deserve our protection, and we need to get the appropriate witnesses in front of this committee as quickly as possible.
All right, then, Monsieur Brunet-Duceppe, s'il vous plaît.
Microphone, please. Please turn off the microphone. I agree with the two witnesses. I believe that Madame Alice Lev is just making sense when she says that we should first invite witnesses in writing, and such invitation, if it is rejected, should be followed by a summons. It just makes sense. And we also need to clarify Mr. Wernick's situation. Is he sick or is he not? That seems to be quite unclear. I don't know if the Madam Chair can confirm for us whether Mr. Wernick is able to appear, because right now it's very mysterious and unclear. If he can appear, then of course he must appear. We must hear him. He's a very important witness. And for obvious reasons, like Mr. Bazan said, then we must issue a summons for Mr. Trotter, because we would not want his chain of command to keep him from appearing. He needs to feel free to appear, and so we must ensure that he is allowed to come. And as for Ms. Estravis and Mr. Wernick, I just use common sense. I sent them an invitation, a written invitation first, and if it is refused, then issue a summons. Thank you very much.
All right, I don't see any further hands raised to comment. I think we've had a bit of a discussion over that, so I would ask Madame Vandenbelt to go ahead to repeat your amendment to make sure we have it clear to clear.
Madam Chair, I did have a question for you as how the invitation was issued to both Mr. Warnick and Ms. Estravis in the past. Was it by email? Was it a letter that was sent to them, or was it a phone call?
All right, so what it was with Mr. Wernick, we did try and get a message to him, because since he's a private citizen now, it was difficult to find a contact. So I'm not sure. So we didn't actually get a formal response, right? When it came to Miss Estravis, we had a hard time finding, with the information that was given to us to find her, we couldn't find her. Then we eventually did find her, but only like less than 24 hours before the meeting. So it was too late. So, and so that's why it didn't end up being like a complete invitation more than 24 hours in advance. So I can understand why that might have been difficult for someone to agree with with 24 hours notice. So if you invite them again, then we have found ways now that we didn't have available to us before. So go ahead, Madame.
I believe that Zita Astravis is in the government directory. And I believe that Mr. Warnick is at MNP. That's the information I've been given.
Thank you very much. We didn't have that.
I'm sure that if you talk to the Minister of Public Safety, you'd find Ms. Estravis very quickly.
Eventually, we did find, but with not the kind of notice. Go ahead. Call. Okay. All right.
The amendment?
All right. Okay. Okay. Go ahead. So, do you want to read out the amendment to make sure we're all clear?
So at the end of the day, what it would be then is that that part at the end of that first paragraph where it says, and the committee issue a summons to the following witnesses to testify, we say, and the committee issue a written invitation to the following, and then have Zita Estravis as A and delete B.
Go ahead, Mr. Bazan.
And Bill, because you're saying that Mr. Warnick is ill, are you positive of that, or you got Mr. Sugar confused with Mr. Warnick?
It's not a confusion. I'm not positive of that. I think that I would stand by the amendment that I put forward.
Madam Gallant.
Madam Chair, I don't understand how the parliamentary secretary would know that Mr. Warnick is ill if the committee can't even find him to get an invitation to him.
Well, we did. We eventually did
how to reach him because she found
him.
out she was ill.
Yeah, we did find him, but it was at the very last moment again. And it's very difficult when we want to invite witnesses for within 24 or 48 hours notice. So
we weren't inviting them
often
for
a
today,
challenge.
Madam Chair. We weren't inviting them for today.
Sorry.
We were just putting them on notice that we're inviting them.
We were at calling the question. I had asked to call the
Yes.
question.
Okay, I would like to, let's have a recorded division. Yes.
Question is on the amendment moved by Ms. Vandenbeld. Mr. Bagnall.
In favor?
Mr. Baker.
In favor?
Mr. Robillard. In favor. Mr. Spankman.
In favor?
Ms. Vandenbeld.
In favor?
Mr. Benson.
I vote against.
Mr. Bizan.
Opposed.
Salislav.
Against.
Ms. Gallant.
Opposed.
Mr. Brunel Duceppe.
Ooh.
Mr. Garrison.
In favor?
The amendment passes. Now, go ahead, Madame Vandenbeld.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chair. As I had mentioned earlier, I do think that for a full study on this, we do need to look at what happened previously when General Vance was appointed. And I know there have been a number of news articles, including in February 5th. And I know that the former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Harper, Ray Novak, did decline comment in that media interview, even though there was some suggestion in the media that perhaps some of this was known at that time. So having said that, and also wondering why it took 3 months when the norm is about 1 month before the change of command happened after General Vance was first named that he was going to be the Chief of Defense Staff, I would move a motion that in addition to the names that are listed under that the committee invite the following witnesses, that we also add E and F, and that would be Ray Novak, the former Chief of Staff to Stephen Harper, and Garrett Newhout, who is the former Chief of Staff to Jason Kenney when he was Minister of Defense.
All right. Are there anyone who want to offer comment on this new amendment? Okay, Mr. Garrison.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. We had previously issued an invitation to the former Defense Minister, Jason Kenney, to appear, and I wondered whether we could have a report on whether we had received any response to that invitation. Otherwise, I do believe that we have so many allegations here stretching across so many years that I do think it's useful for us to understand what the real commitment was to tackle sexual misconduct within the Canadian military by those who were in charge, and that the two witnesses suggestions amendment could be useful. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Garrison. And we did get in contact with Mr. Kenney, and he said due to schedules and the demands that he would not be available. So, that in answer to your question. Mr. Bazan.
So I just say that I think that, you know, in Mr. Premier Kenny's case, that he's got a pandemic that he's fighting, and he's got his hands quite full doing COVID vaccine rollout. So I don't think we should expect him to come. Perhaps having former chiefs of staff appear that were working for Mr. Harper and Mr. Kenny at that time may shed some light. However, we know that there was an investigation, and it may raise more questions about the investigative service as well as the PCO vetting, and I think that is critical information that we should look into, and how some of these things have slid through. And same can be said about the appointment of Admiral MacDonald, because it seems that it was quite well known within the armed forces about the incident that occurred over a decade ago, and yet that never seemed to come to light within the PCO or in the minister's office, or maybe it did and we didn't know what happened there. So I think that there's a lot of questions around the appointment process that we want to look at.
Thank you, Mr. Bazan. And then anyone else to talk to this Second Amendment? All right, then let's do a recorded division on this amendment.
Question is on the amendment, moved by Ms. Van den Belt. Mr. Bagnall,
In favor?
Mr. Baker,
In favor.
Monsieur Robillard,
In favor.
Mr. Spangman,
In favor.
Ms. Van den Belt,
In favor?
Mr. Benson,
In favor.
Mr. Bazan, Ms. Allislav,
In favor?
Ms. Gallant,
In favor.
Monsieur Brunel Duceppe,
Who?
Mr. Garrison,
In favor.
Okay, thank you. So the motion passes, the amendment to the motion passes, and now to the main motion, unless there's some reason not to go there. All right, a recorded division on the main motion, which has had two amendments.
The question is on the main motion as amended. Mr. Bagnall,
You're on mute, Mr. Bagnall.
In favor?
Mr. Baker,
In favor.
Monsieur Robillard,
Who?
Mr. Spangman,
In favor.
Ms. Van den Belt,
In favor.
Benson,
In favor.
Mr. Bazan, Ms. Allislav,
In favor?
Ms. Gallant,
In favor.
Monsieur Brunel Duceppe,
Who?
carries.
In favor.
Motion passes. All right. Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Bazan.
Okay, I have a second motion that I wish to present that has also been circulated to all members. And I'll read it into the record and then I'll speak to that motion, Madam Chair. That in respect of the committee's study regarding the allegation.
And by just a minute, Mr. Bazan.
Both motions were sent to you. Oh, geez. I'll get my staff to send it. I'm going to read it into the records as we're dealing with business, and I'll make sure that that gets forwarded in. It's just been sent to you for confirmation, Mr. Clerk. So that in respect of the committee study regarding the allegations of sexual misconduct against former Chief of Defense Staff General Jonathan Vance, the committee sent for all electronic and paper correspondence, including but not limited to emails, text messages, memos, and briefing notes concerning the allegations against General Vance in March 2018 and the period of March 1st to May 31st, 2019, inclusive, between Gary Walborn and the Privy Council Office, Zita Estravis and Gary Walborn, the Minister of National Defense or Deputy Minister, and the Privy Council Office, Zita Estravis and the Privy Council Office, Elder Marquis and the Privy Council Office, Zita Estravis and Elder Marquis, and Elder Marquis and Gary Walborn, that the parliamentary law clerk remove any information that could identify the person or persons making an allegation or who may have been the subject of misconduct by General Vance, that these documents be tabled at committee no later than 10 days following the adoption of this motion, and should these records not be turned over within 10 days to the parliamentary law clerk in an unredacted form, that the chair, at the earliest opportunity, report to the House the following report, in quotes, your committee, having requested and not received certain documents from the Department of National Defense and the Privy Council Office, therefore recommends that should this report be concurred in, that an order the House do issue for the unredacted version of all documents produced by the government in response to the March 8th, 2021 order of the Standing Committee on National Defense, and that these documents shall be turned over to the parliamentary law clerk within one sitting day of the adoption of this order, and that the parliamentary law clerk remove any information that could identify the person or persons making an allegation against or who may have been the subject of misconduct by General Vance before turning the documents over to the Standing Committee on National Defense. So, Madam Chair, I'll just speak to that, and we'll make sure that that motion is received and circulated as quickly as possible to everyone. That's my error. I do apologize for that. But we are seeing a lot of documentation that has been released already in the media through ATIPs.
I would just request that until we get a copy of that motion, because it was very, very long and I didn't quite catch it, if we could just suspend till the motion is distributed.
Yeah,
Thank
okay.
you.
All right, we're going to suspend and then we'll get that out there. call this meeting back into order. Go ahead, Mr. Bazan. You can finish your.
And one of the responsibilities of dealing with work here at committee is the power of committee to demand the production of papers from government departments. And we know that there has been a number of memos and briefing notes that have been accessed by the media through access to information requests, and that those have now been published. I believe, and I think that most committee members would agree, that there's probably a paper trail in the minister's office, in the deputy minister's office, in the PMO and the PCO over the I guess the report that Gary Walborn gave to the minister back in March of 2018. So I think it's pertinent to the study to look at the exchange of information and to find out why there was no action taken on the report of sexual misconduct allegations against General Vance. You also notice that there is a time in here for 2019, April to May of 2019, to look at those documents as well. And as we all know, General Vance received a significant boost in salary at that time, and we should find out why and look at his performance review that was submitted from the minister's office to the PCO for consideration as a GIC appointment, a government and council appointment, and whether or not that reflects the issue of the allegations that the former defense ombudsman had brought to the attention of the minister. And from all communications, we know that others in the minister's office and the deputy minister's office were aware of the allegations. So I think it is pertinent to all of us to know what happened. So the critical information is correspondence and communications, as Gary Walborn pointed out, that he was summoned to the PCO office. We need to know how that took place. And so all the paper and electronic communications are critical, I think, to the study, especially as we look at process and ensuring a transparent and fair process for sexual misconduct allegations to be brought forward free of interference. And also, we want to make sure that they are being respected within the chain of command, including at the political level within the minister's office and the PMO. So with that, and that's why Elder Marquis is a part of the correspondence. So with that, I would like to make sure that everybody can support this, because I think it's germane to our study on sexual misconduct and improving the system to protect our women in the Canadian Armed Forces.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Bazan. We have 6 people on the list: Bagnall, Spengeman, Baker, Garrison, Brunel, Duceppe. Okay, go ahead, Mr. Bagnall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would have preferred to have this a little in advance. As it was said, this is fairly complicated, and would have been nice to have some time to look at it in more detail. But and does this do these documents include the ones that were available during the appointment of General Vance? But my main point is that I want to go back to what I said previously today and at the last meeting. Maybe I'm the only one, but I want to make sure our study is on the things that can most, or doesn't miss the things that can most help the women in our military feel protected. And that's changing the systems so that the various investigative systems are open and independent and available, and women feel protected, and that we have such witnesses and information that will help them. And as the experts that have testified so far say, it's a change in culture, so that those witnesses that will be suggesting mechanisms to change the culture. So I'm going to continue to lobby for that as throughout this study. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Spengeman, please.
Madam Chair, thank you very much, and I appreciate the motion. I too also did not get it ahead of time, and it is complicated and probably requires some thought. But I wanted to raise a couple of general issues that I think have been echoed by colleagues across all sides of the aisle. And Mr. Bazan himself said it's International Women's Day. I think Mr. Garrison referred to the fact that it's important to put the rights and wishes of victims and serving members and their families front and center in our consideration. This is really an inquiry that goes, yes, to particular incidents with respect to former chiefs of defense staff, but most importantly, Madam Chair, it goes to a challenge of system change that's required. This is not just an issue that involves a couple of bad incidents. It's an issue that involves a system that is defective. And the minister was quite clear. The minister called for a complete and total culture change. And he put the notion of trust front and center in our considerations. I just wanted to echo that and to encourage colleagues, all members of the committee, to keep that in the forefront of our minds as we go forward. How do we protect the wishes of the victims if we now go into an inquiry that goes into emails, texts, and very particular correspondence, some of which at least may well be subject to an ongoing investigation? I appreciate Mr. Bazan's comment that these can be edited out or redacted or withheld. But what does it do with respect to the idea of trust in the system if, from the political track, we get an inquiry that really sort of puts out everything that forms part of these discussions? The other thing to consider, we just passed a motion by Mr. Bazan and as amended by colleagues that introduced additional witnesses, many of whom will be able to comment on the basis of documentary evidence or emails or texts that they've sent. So a lot of the information that'll be required will come forward that way. So I'm questioning the usefulness of going to that level of detail when there is a risk of eroding further trust in the process, particularly as it relates to the rights and wishes of the victims and the question of system change. Yes, we need to inquire about these two incidents, but we also need to turn our minds to what we need to do really to transform the system as a whole across individual incidents to make sure that they don't happen again. How past, present, and future personnel of the armed forces, women and men, are going to regain trust in this institution as an inclusive, diverse workplace that is based upon respect and tolerance and recognition of the service and contributions of all members, no matter what their gender, no matter what their background is. So once again, my call is to the committee to really put the system challenge front and center, put the rights of victims front and center, and to look forward to a way to actually change the system and make it what it should be, which is an inclusive workplace that all Canadians can aspire to and want to aspire to. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Spangam. And Mr. Baker, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And so I have a couple of concerns with this motion. We've heard from those witnesses who've come forward to this committee on this topic today in the last several meetings, including from Mr. Walburn, how reluctant people are to come forward for a variety of reasons. One of those reasons is the perception and that their name may be disclosed, that there may be retribution in some form. And I think we've all on all sides, all members of this committee have commented on the importance of protecting those who wish to come forward. And so I'm very concerned about this. I know that there's, in the language of the motion, there's language suggesting that the clerk remove anything that could help identify a person. But to be frank, and I of course don't know what would be within these documents, and I can only imagine. But I would find it incredibly. I'm having trouble understanding what information that is useful to this committee from these documents the clerk could leave in without risking the breach of confidentiality that we've talked about preserving for those who are coming forward. And so I just don't know if that's practical, I guess is what I'm saying. It's not just about names of people, it's about dates, it's about locations, it's about whatever's being discussed. All of those things are things that could potentially allow someone to be identified and for them to face exactly what they don't want to face and exactly what we've all, I think, talked about having to protect, which is their their anonymity and if they wish it, and protect them from any kind of potential retribution. So I'm very concerned, very, very practically about what this would do as far as because this information would come through a number of people's hands, and like I said, I think it's impractical for someone to completely eliminate any information that could possibly be used to identify the people concerned. So that's my first concern. The second concern I have is that is along the lines of what Mr. Spengeman spoke to, which is setting what I just said, irrespective of what I just said, though I think the two issues are linked. The signal we are sending here is that if someone comes forward with an allegation, that there's a risk that now or in the future, there's a risk that a parliamentary committee could request documents that pose a risk that may lead to public or known to people, and therefore being made public after the fact. And I think that's to me, I would think that would have a very chilling effect on those who do want to come forward. I think, from my vantage point, I really, really want to make sure that we come out of this process focused on solving the problem. And I think this motion, would not help to solve that. I think it would contribute to part of the problem that we've heard from Mr. Walburn on and others on, which is the importance of protecting the people who've come forward or want to come forward in the future. So those are my two concerns, and I would urge us not to go down this path for those reasons. I think if we're serious about protecting the people who are coming forward, let's start by hearing from the witnesses that we've all agreed should be invited to the committee. Let's hear from them. I'm just not sure that I think this is incredibly risky. This would be incredibly risky and do potential harm to serving people who want to come forward in the future. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, Mr. Garrison, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I want to start by suggesting that I do think it's problematic to frame this question as protecting women. And I don't believe that's intentional on the part of members of the committee. But what we're talking about here, if you talk about protection, you're talking about something where we're trying to design protections against something which is inevitable. I think we have to frame this question about the right of women to serve equally in the Canadian forces. And what the committee needs to be investigating is how that went wrong at the highest levels. So we've had a minister and a government that's been telling us for 6 years now that they have zero tolerance for sexual misconduct. And as I've always said, zero tolerance is an aspiration, not a policy. And so the documents that we're asking for here are not looking at individual cases, or not to look at the truth or falsity of those accusations, but to look at how those serving in the highest levels in Canadian forces, and as the minister, frankly, dealt with allegations. Were they dealt with in a way that was effective and resulted in effective investigations and action? Clearly, the most recent incidents indicate that did not happen. And I believe that these documents may be helpful and probably will be helpful in allowing us to see why that happened. So for that reason, I am supporting this motion.
Et Monsieur Boulnez-Duceppe, s'il vous plaît.
Well, Randall, I must say I agree with Randall. At stake is a question of confidence and trust. We've been talking about this trust since the beginning of this study, whether there is trust or whether there isn't trust. And we can see that right now there is no trust. This document, I believe, will help us to shed light on many different matters. For example, how this issue is managed by the top brass. That's what we need to know. And this document will help us know. And I think this is very clear in the motion, where it says, sorry if I can find my place, it would be where it says that it would be impossible to identify anyone. So I support this motion because the more information we have, the easier it is for us to do our work. And that is the point of this committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate the interventions from my colleagues. And I think that if we want to inspire confidence in women serving in the Canadian Armed Forces, we need to make sure that we fix this process. And when we have a failure at the highest levels of government in ensuring that their concerns and allegations are dealt with in a timely manner, we need to get down to the bottom of what happened here. Now, again, the committee has the power to man the production of papers. We're asking the law clerk to redact anything in there that would hurt those investigations or the names and incident as they have come about. We also know that most of this has already been reported in the media, so there isn't a whole lot of secrets. What is the secret is how this was handled within the minister's office, within the PCO, and within the PMO, and so that's why we need these documents so we get down to the bottom. I can see why Liberal members are scared to have that come forward because they've been participating in a bit of a cover up of their own to protect the minister. But we need to find out what was actually said, what was written, what was done, and what wasn't done when we're trying to deal with these serious allegations of misconduct by General Vance and in particular, but now we're also going to want to look at everything on the McDonald file as well. But this is specific to General Vance, what we have seen already released publicly, and this is, really us as committee members should be able to get more information than the media. And so I do, again, encourage my colleagues that we have an opportunity here to do some very serious work and have a great outcome that will improve the processes as well as inspire women to sign up for the Canadian Armed Forces with a lot more confidence that they will be in a safe and healthy work environment.
Monsieur Robillard, s'il vous plaît.
Madame la Présidente, je pense que nous devons de recentrer le débat.
Madam Chair, please turn off your mic. Madam Chair, we must concentrate on the victims. Please turn the mic off in the room. We must support them better. How can we support them better? How can we ensure that their issues are at the very heart of the process? How can we change the process to ensure that the victims are at the heart of the process?
Robillard, Mr. Baker, please. And then.
Thank you, Chair. So I'd like to first, Madam Chair, this is the second time in this committee hearing today where a member of one of the Conservative members has alleged that one or more of the Liberal members are engaged in a cover-up, and I resent that allegation, and I don't know, Madam Chair, if there's an opportunity or a mechanism to ask the member to withdraw, but I'd like it for the record to be stated. I want to make sure that I'm clear on the record that I resent that allegation. There is no evidence to support that there was any kind of cover-up going on, and to allege that other members of this committee are participating in a cover-up, I think is reprehensible. On the issue at hand, in terms of the motion, again, I think we're aligned in our desire to have to ensure that the military is a safe place for people of all backgrounds, men and women alike, that we want to eliminate sexual harassment and other inappropriate behavior. I think we're all aligned on that. I don't, however, think that requesting documents that pose a risk of someone being identified helps to achieve that goal. And I'm concerned about the signal that we're sending. I'm concerned about the practical elements of this. I'm really concerned that someone could be identified through this process. But I'm also concerned that it's sending a signal to men and women that who want to come forward, who may want to come forward, who have come forward, that their information could potentially be shared in a much broader setting by a defense committee. To me, what we've heard from witness after witness who's come to this committee, including Mr. Walburn, was the importance of, in instances like this, when allegations are brought forward, that there be an independent investigation outside of the chain of command. And to me, for us to, for there to be any sense that any of the information that's relevant to these issues being shared, to these investigations that should be handled by independent professionals, not us at this committee, um, uh, the, that information could get presented to a committee in a public forum, to me, is not the way in which we make this a safe place for people to come forward. And I think I'm concerned that that the that we're not, but if we pass such a motion, we're not doing right by those folks who the other members have said that they want to make sure feel safe in the military. I'm concerned about that. I think information like this belongs with an investigative body only. And if we risk or even create a perception that there's a risk that that confidential or sensitive information could be shared, information that's been shared with an ombudsman or shared in a setting that is designed to be safe, I think that's a very dangerous thing. I think it sends a dangerous precedent. I think it sends a signal to people who want to come forward that their information could be shared. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Baker. Mr. Spengeman, and followed by Mr. Bagnall.
Madam Chair, thank you very much. And I wanted to revert to my earlier comments, but before I do that, I wanted to echo the concern that was raised by my colleague, Mr. Baker. This is the second time at this committee session that there's been a reference from a Conservative member to a cover-up. Most recently by Mr. Bazan, it was a general reference. There was a much more specific reference earlier in the meeting against a colleague of ours at the table. That she was engaged in a cover-up. It was put in the form of a question, so it wasn't a direct allegation, but that member that raised this tried to do indirectly what she knows she can't do directly. And that puts a different lens on the way I'm thinking about the Conservative position on this. This is not necessarily now, in my mind, an exercise to actually get to the facts. This is an exercise to prove that there's a cover-up. It has a political lens, a political taint, and I don't think a victim of sexual misconduct or worse in the Canadian Forces should become an instrument for these kinds of tactics. We have a victim in this particular case who we know that expressed a very clear preference not to go forward. And now to more generally to the motion as the very next thing, without even having read an email and under the lens of proving a cover-up, to go forward and ask for every bit of correspondence that potentially could prove that, carefully extracting her name perhaps from every single email, report, document, or text, but in aggregate, it could still, as Mr. Baker suggested, pose a very high risk of the identity of this particular complainant being exposed in the course of these proceedings. We've agreed previously, Madam Chair, today to a motion to bring additional witnesses, including the Minister, to return. And this information can come out through conversation with these officials. If there are reports that are referenced in conversation, the committee has in its discretion to request an undertaking for that report to be brought to the committee subject to confidentiality redactions. But to now ask for absolutely every email, text, and report in the context of essentially a fishing expedition to prove a cover-up, I don't think does justice for this victim, and much more profoundly doesn't do an inch of good to advance the real issue, which is systemic culture change that's required in the Canadian Forces. I have yet to hear a constructive thought from my Conservative colleagues on how to achieve that. I'm very open to hearing them, and I'm hoping that in the context of our work going forward, that will be the focus of our discussion. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Spengeman. On to Mr. Bagnall, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Well, of course, I agree with what Mr. Spengeman just said. That's the point I've been making, that that should be the focus of our committee. When I put my hand up, it was to make a point that Mr. Baker has now made very well, and that is that, there's the two problems. One is the culture, which I said we should be trying to come up with solutions to that, and we haven't got very far in that, and that's what the experts say is the problem. But second of all, another issue is that people are afraid to come forward. They don't want it to be public, etc. And if there's a lot of protections in the system that have been put in the system now to protect anonymity, to allow people to feel comfortable to come forward, to not go into a formal investigation, but to come forward and air their concerns or have consultations or have counseling, or they should have the choice to be anonymous, as long as it fits natural justice. And then all of a sudden, we have a defense committee that's going to override their ability for anonymity. As Mr. Bazan said, a lot of this is in the media, so that would make it much more easy to identify a person whose the document refers to. Some of the ones that were being brought forward under this sort of broad umbrella of documents, and because of what's in the media already, it could be easily perused, even though their name is not in it, who the document came from. So I think all committee members should think about that. Are we overriding the protection that we're trying to give individuals to come forward confidentially and air their concerns? Thank you.
All right, thank you. Mr. Baker, please.
Thank you, Chair. I think that something we should consider is something that Mr. Spangeman mentioned earlier, which is that we have access to witnesses that we've agreed or that we've passed motions to invite to this committee, and I think they are largely the ones that are mentioned in this motion that we're debating right now. And I think we could certainly learn a lot from those, from them, I suspect. And so we could do that without taking the risk. Why not do that and not take the risk of exposing someone who's come forward? So to me, that would be the rationale for not passing this motion. I think we'd be taking a great risk. I also think, I think we have to be thinking about, we have investigative bodies whose role it is to look into these cases, and I think our role in this should be to look into allegations of sexual harassment and assault. And I think what we should be doing is focusing on how we make the system better for victims. We've heard about a range of things that can be done from witnesses who've come forward. I think those are the things that this committee should be tasked with. That's our mandate. I also do agree with something that one of my colleagues, Mr. Spangeman, mentioned earlier, which is, now that a couple of members of the conservative of this committee who are on the conservative bench have alleged that there's a cover-up without evidence to support that. It clearly shows that this is about politics, and I struggle with what signal that sends to people who want to come forward, that politics will potentially trump their safety, their security, the protection that we should be helping to afford for them and provide for them. So I wanted to add those points, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you. Mr. Robillard, please.
Madam Chair, since the very beginning of this case, media have said that the meeting between the minister and the ombudsman was due to an inappropriate email from 2012. It has nothing to do with the recent statements of Major Brennan. Therefore, I'd like to know what the status of this investigation is about Mr. Brennan's statements. Could we have information about this investigation? What was the process followed? And how was it triggered? And who is overseeing this investigation?
Okay, that's a good question. I would imagine we could probably find. Well, we have to be very careful, right? We don't want to prejudice an ongoing investigation, but there may be a witness that we could find that could talk to that in general terms, but not specific. So we'll take that under advisement and see if we can find an answer to your question. Okay, well, okay. Who's up next?
Next is Mr. Levy.
No, he just finished.
Then Mr. Bagnell.
Okay, Mr. Bagnell, and then
Mr.
Spangenen,
And then Baker.
and then Baker. Okay.
Thank you. Just following up my previous comment, I'd just like to hear from those
Please turn off your microphone in the room.
that are in favor of the motion if they're convinced that all these documents, some of them would be fine, but if all these documents would really protect the anonymity of those that want to be anonymous, considering that with the information that's out there now, it might be pretty obvious as to what document refers to what person.
Okay, on to Mr. Spengeman then, please.
Madam Chair, thank you briefly. And just to circle back to my earlier comments, I mean, the Canadian Forces did set up institutions to specifically protect the anonymity of victims who want to come forward and to empower and enable them to do so, like the Sexual Misconduct Response Center. It is individual documents, records, emails, texts, all the things that are mentioned in the motion that create a risk. But the real risk, Madam Chair, is the aggregate effect of all these documents being out there in the public realm, and the aggregate effect, to my knowledge, is not being assessed by those people that are checking the confidentiality of this. Once they're all out there, the sort of cross linkage of these various documents, even though none of them may have the name of the complainant or victim in them, could still, in fairly clear terms, point into the direction of the complainant. And further, Madam Chair, could be used by members of the public who will then see them to speculate as to who the complainant might be. And that is beyond the control of the committee. So the committee, in that sense, will have failed to do its part to protect the wishes and the identity of the victim. I just want to stress that once again for the consideration of all members.
Okay, Mr. Baker, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think one of the things we have to think about, and we've heard from witnesses not just during this particular the study of this particular issue, but in the study of past issues about that we need to. The Canadian Armed Forces have always had to, but especially now, need to attract people who have a much broader array of skills than perhaps has been required in the past. Whether that be, examples of this that we've heard about at this committee are things like expertise in cyber and technology and communications and so on and so forth, that require us to be able to attract the best in a diversity of people with that array of backgrounds. And so, again, I guess I want to come back to this motion. And speaking to this motion, what I want to say is that I'm a little bit concerned, not just about what I've said earlier, which is, the chilling impact that this would have on people who want to come forward with allegations in the future. And I'm of course concerned about the impact it could have on the people who have come forward in these cases and have asked that we know that according to Mr. Walburn, at least the one in the case of Mr. Walburn, asked that their identity be protected, and we need to respect that. I'm concerned about those things, but I'm also concerned about what this does to our ability to attract the best and brightest and with that diverse group of set of skills that I just talked about to the forces. I really think we need to put Canadians and how they're impacted by the armed forces first, and we need to put the people who want to come forward first in our deliberations here when they want to come forward with allegations of any wrongdoing, including sexual harassment or assault. So when I think about those groups of people, and this, to me, this motion would have the impact of not doing either of those things, both because of what I've said earlier in terms of how it would, what signal it would send to those who might want to come forward and who have come forward, but also because it sends a signal to others who may be considering joining the forces, or who are in the forces and are considering their options. That information that is expected to remain confidential, that their interests are being looked after and put first. And I'm a little nervous that this motion, for the reasons I've stated and others have, would not do that.
Right through. Okay, Monsieur Brunet-Duceppe, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The motion clearly states that the documents that will be sent that it will be impossible to identify anyone. The motion is quite clear. We heard the Liberals' arguments. I understand, but I don't agree. I think that we have extensively discussed this, so I think we would be ready to vote on this, because I think that the same points are being repeated in the past 10 minutes. And I think that most people are ready to vote. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay. Is it a point? I have one person ahead of you. Okay, go ahead, Madame Alislev, please.
First, I would like to agree with my colleague from the block that I think the same arguments are being repeated, so I think it probably is time to put the question. However, I would like to just add that the testimony of the Ombudsman and the ATIP documents that have been made public to the media, or not, that have been reported on in the public by the media, suggest that perhaps senior officials did not follow the rules around protecting confidences and protecting victims and the information that they were given. I think that is a critical aspect that we need to understand more about, because it would show that those who knew what the rules were apparently were not following those rules, which did compromise perhaps the identity of the victims and the process of the investigation. So that may in itself be another process that's broken that we need to understand by seeing these documents. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead, Madame Vanderbilt, and then Mr. Bagnall, please.
Yes, no, it was just on the issue of calling the question, because once our other colleagues who are ahead of me have a chance to speak, then I may have an amendment. So I don't think we can call the question yet.
All right, then on to Mr. Bagnall, please.
Thank you, and I appreciate Madame Alislev and Mr. Brunel-Duceppe responding to my request that you were confident that this would not impinge on people that wanted to be confidential, wanted their information that they submitted to be in confidence, but would just like to hear from anyone else that's in favor of the motion. It's obvious that some of these documents are related to specific things that, as Mr. Bazan said, were already in the media. So the personal details that someone may not have wanted to be public could now be made public. And I just want to make sure that committee members don't think that this is really offering the wrong sense to people, that they can come forward in confidence if they wish to.
Okay, Mr. Spengeman, please.
Madam Chair, thank you, and I'll be brief. Just to reiterate that we're dealing with two things. We're dealing with the investigation of the conduct of two former chiefs of defense staff, important issues, important questions. We're also dealing with the overriding question, which is how to change the system. Again, the minister was very clear. He called for a complete and total culture change to restore trust in the Canadian Forces. I do not see in the motion, as it's reflected, even a reference to potential documents within the public service or elsewhere that have explored questions of culture change or how to achieve it within the Canadian Forces in the context of Ob Honor. So we're having a one-sided conversation. We're looking at one side of the problem, and it's the side that's riskiest to the victim in this particular case and to future victims, because of the perception that the minute an allegation is raised, that there'll be a scramble to score political points, and the victim's safety and wishes are subordinated to the wishes of what I perceive to be the Conservative position, at least. We do need to keep our eyes on that second and, in my view, equally important question, which is how do we achieve culture change in the Canadian Forces? It would be great to have some ideas on how the committee could integrate the current state of knowledge in the civil service on that question and get some information from the witnesses that have been invited to address that.
Okay, thank you. On to Mr. Baker, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I think I wanted to respond to what Ms. Alislev had just spoken to, and some of the other members have at this committee today, which is the point that appropriate steps weren't followed. And I think what we've heard from witnesses who come forward is, including Mr. Walburn, is that how important it is that investigations of allegations be handled appropriately and professionally, and appropriately includes things like protecting the people who've come forward, and whether that means protecting their identity and ensuring that they don't face negative consequences, but certainly respecting their wishes throughout that process. And I don't think that we have we've sought out that consent from the people who've come forward making the allegations in this case, and so I think it concerns me that we, on the one hand, are speaking about how we want to protect victims and those who come forward and do what's right by them, but at the same time, we are willing to make public documents that pose the risk of not respecting their wishes. I think that is not appropriate. It's not fair to those people who've come forward, and I just urge my colleagues to consider that before voting on this motion. I think the other point that has been made, and it was made by Ms. Alislev, I believe, but certainly by others, is the fact that appropriate steps weren't followed. And appropriate steps, I think we've heard from many of our witnesses, are to have that investigation handled in that professional and independent way outside of the chain of command. And so having, when, from what we know, from what has been presented to us, we know that when the Minister of Defense was made aware of allegations, that he sought out the body whose role it is to lead such investigations in the cases of people like the Chief of Defense Staff, because there is a governor and council appointment. And so we have a situation where that was approached in what appears to be what I believe is the appropriate way, given the circumstances, given the need to make sure that that investigation is handled professionally and independently and competently by people who are not within the chain of command. In this case, the minister is within the chain of command, and so those are some of the reasons, Chair, that I think we have witnesses that we've agreed to have invited. Those folks can come forward and speak to some of these issues but we don't need to have, I think, take the risk of exposing victims or people who come forward with allegations. I think let's refocus our energy on fixing the problem rather than on the desire, as Mr. Spengeman sort of highlighted earlier, to try to find a way to insinuate that there's some sort of cover-up. I think that's unfair to the victims. I think let's put the victims first, and let's not allow politics to put them at risk.
Thank you. Mr. Rubio, please.
Oui, Madame la Présidente.
Madam Chair, according to Operation Honors Manual, some repercussions in the short term and long term of sexual misconduct are the following: fearing leaving home or fearing people in general. Regaining trust is more difficult if the victim has been targeted by someone in whom she had for whom she had respect and trust. In that case, trust in general can be affected. There is also the person can think that it's not important to ask for help. There's also victim blaming. She may think that she created the incident. Victims can also feel responsible for not listening to their own instinct. And it's also possible that they didn't detect sexual misconduct. And the victim can feel shameful. She can also feel shameful for allowing the aggression. And she can hesitate to ask the help for the police. The victim can see that her former sexual life will be analyzed. So it's important to keep the confidentiality of the identity of the people because it can have a great effect on their mental health. These are just a few consequences for the victims. So we have to take that into account. Victims should be our first priority, our absolute priority. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Bagnall, please.
Thank you. And I just wonder, right at the very beginning of this debate, I asked if this included documents related to General Vance's appointment. So my question is, do they? And if not, has anyone proposed an amendment to include those? And my second question is, I don't know if the clerk or who would be able to answer this, but is the government allowed to unredact information that's been given to the government in confidence under systems that allow input in confidence, confidential? Could they actually, in good conscience, redact that information because at the time it was given under a system of confidential information? Thank you.
Mr. Spengman. Thank you. Mr. Spengeman, please.
Madam Chair, thank you very much. And just a brief point, in addition to my earlier points, with respect to what we heard from the former ombudsperson and the wishes of the complainant very clearly expressed that this not be brought forward as a complaint, that her identity be protected, and that any conversations that would happen on the basis of strict anonymity. And the ombudsperson also made reference to the fact that he was going to the minister to, quote unquote, obtain top cover for whatever his next steps would be. Defective as that system may be in retrospect as a whole, in the sense that we have to focus on independent institutions, institutions outside of the chain of command that protect the identity of the victim, the Sexual Misconduct Response Center, other institutions that the committee may turn its mind to. It would also be disillusioning to the complainant and to other complainants to know that in this particular case, even that step of obtaining top cover, as it was intended by the ombudsperson, would not be protected, because any and all emails, texts, reports, correspondence would be brought forward, redacted as they may be. As I've said earlier, the aggregate effect of that exercise could be, and with high risk levels, maybe. To ultimately lead to the identity of the victim and complainant being exposed, which is not at all what this committee should endorse or stand for. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right. Is it Madame Gallant? Mr. Baker. Oh, Mr. Baker. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to go back to something that I was speaking about a few moments ago, in the context of the protection of people who've come forward with allegations. And one of the things that I think is really, really important is that we avoid certainly the substance of, or the perception of political interference when in any kind of process that is meant to be arm's length, and whether that be the justice system, military justice system, or in the case of investigations of allegations like the ones that we've heard about. And so I think that speaks a little bit to why I suspect it speaks to why the Privy Council's office is a body that is responsible for initiating investigations of GIC appointed individuals like the Chief of Defense Staff, like Mr. Vance, and I think it's important to keep that in mind as we talk a lot about this issue. And there's allegations of a cover up. I think it's helpful to understand that when allegations are brought forward, that there's a reason we have police, there's a reason we have investigative bodies and ombudsmen and other bodies that have been created to help address this issue, to help investigate, but also to protect those coming forward with allegations. And so the risk of politicization, there's a great risk of if you bring it to a political body, you risk politicization. And I think that sort of speaks to why Privy Council's office is currently, at least, responsible for those investigations of those allegations against governor and council appointees, like General Vance. I think in that same spirit, I think the what's happening here in this committee on this motion is something similar. The politics are getting in the way of potentially protecting the people coming forward, and certainly getting in the way of us really doing what we're elected to do, which is to fix the problems in the system and make the system better. And so I really think that this motion is more about politics, and it's not so much about the substance. And I think that not only that, but it poses a massive, massive risk to people who we need to protect. And so I'd urge my colleagues to think about some of the testimony we've heard from the various folks who've come forward, that we think about some of the reports that have been written by our former Supreme Court Justice, by others who've talked about how we need to address allegations and how they can be brought forward in a way that's safe for members of the forces. What kind of support needs to be provided to them, not just to them, but to their families. When we've heard from people who've brought forward allegations themselves, and how important it is that they have support, that their families have support. We've heard from them on that. We've heard about some of the resources that need to be provided to members of the CAF to make sure that, not just to counsel them through this process as if they make an allegation, but to help ensure that they're protected. We've heard about that, and I think we've heard about a number of other issues as well, and suggestions as to how we can make the system work better. We talked about culture. My colleague, Mr. Bagnall, raises that regularly. We heard, and I think it was 2 meetings ago, from a number of witnesses who spoke about the role of culture, and particularly in the Canadian Armed Forces, and how that's one of the driving factors of the problem that we face today. And so I think let's do right by the people who are being impacted by this, and let's focus on solving the problem instead of using politicizing this issue. And I just urge my colleagues to focus on the matter at hand. Let's help those folks. Let's fix this problem going forward. That's what we're elected to do. I think this motion, as I said, doesn't help us to do that. But it does pose great danger to members of the forces. Thank you.
All right, Madame Gallant, please.
For allowing me to interject during this filibuster. When the military ombudsman came forward with the allegations, He did so in the greatest of he held the confidence of the victims. He did not provide anything to the minister because the minister pushed it away and didn't want to see it. And he kept his confidence as well when the Privy Council officers interrogated him the next day. So it perplexes me as to why the Liberal members of this committee think that the names of these victims are being bantered about amongst members of the public service in the Prime Minister's office and his department. As far as we know, Mr. Walburn kept all the names of the victims confidential, which would lead us to another question if we don't get these documents as requested. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Bagnall, please.
Thank you. As to be consistent, as I've said from the beginning, I think the most important thing is to look at ways to improve the culture so this doesn't happen again, and which is a long effort, but we'll need a number of provisions, and we haven't done that. And then the second thing I said we need to look at is the procedures. You know, when a complaint comes into the department, you know, does it go to the right investigative bodies and everything to make sure that is clear. But now it seems related to this motion that we need also to look at the methods of protection of anonymity of people coming forth that can't just be overridden and have their information public. Obviously, as Mr. Bazan said, there's a number of these items are already public, so it might easily be able to identify which person is being referred to. But I still wanted an answer to my question about redaction. If a government is allowed to redact something that's been provided to it in confidence, and it's pretty hard to be comfortable without an answer to that question. And I'm not sure what technical expert can provide that.
Okay, Mr. Spengeman, please.
Madam Chair, thank you once again. And just sitting back and reflecting on comments over the course of the last hour, I think my question at this point is what would Canadians want us to do? What does this problem mean to them? Yes, they are concerned. They're concerned because there are misconduct allegations against two former chiefs of defense staff. Yes, they're concerned because they realize there's a systemic issue with respect to gender equality, sexual harassment, potentially sexual assault, also diversity and inclusion more broadly within the Canadian Forces. But they also have respect for the Canadian Forces and their deployments overseas and their service at home and their service during the pandemic. They believe in the Canadian Forces as something that's quintessentially Canadian, something that's quintessentially Canadian, but where systemic and serious problems persist. And over the course of the last hour, we've basically been told in no uncertain terms by two members of the Conservative Party that they believe that there's a cover-up without having introduced any evidence to that effect. And the only way to read this motion now is as the dragnet or the fishing expedition, that is to consolidate the conclusion of a cover-up. When we have just agreed, once again, Madam Chair, to a number of witnesses to appear or reappear who have the information in the follow-up to the session that we had with the former ombudsperson to give additional testimony, to give their version of the story, to hopefully give their views of how the Canadian Forces can and should be changed to eliminate this culture of systemic sexual harassment and more disturbingly, the data that supports sexual assault, the prevalence of sexual assault in large percentages within the Canadian Forces. There's serious work to be done. There's work to be done that, yes, needs to focus on the investigation of these two cases by protecting the victim and the complainants in this case, but also by being forward-looking and to say, how do we, especially now that it's happened for the second time, how do we make sure we can change the system to preserve this extremely valuable institution called the Canadian Forces that has done tremendous historical service, tremendous current service at home and abroad, as I said, and that also represents a very distinct and by many accounts valuable and necessary employment opportunity for Canadians. Canadians should be able to aspire to a role in the Canadian Forces without any trepidation or fear of being harassed or otherwise mistreated. That's really where the committee should direct its attention. For the last hour, we've debated something that is much more political in nature than what we should be looking at, I think, as a committee across party lines. We should try to move forward and develop solutions. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you, Mr. Spangam. And Mr. Robillard, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to continue in the same vein as Mr. Baker. Prime Minister Harper appointed General Vance in the summer of 2015. I wonder what our colleagues would have said if a defense minister, a Liberal defense minister, had sanctioned a Conservative nomination. It could have been seen as a political attack, an unfounded one. Before making a decision that could start an inquiry, we need to verify the facts. The Privy Council attempted to have information on this complaint from the Ombudsman, who refused to give up this data. My point here is that we need to change the system so that victims can testify without fear of reprisals. Could we work towards this goal?
Merci, Monsieur Robillard.
Thank you, Monsieur Robillard. Monsieur Paulus. Thank you, Madam Chair. What I've been hearing is that we're playing politics, but there's a problem, a real problem. This reminds me of the SNC-Lavalin affair from 3 years ago. It was the same kind of operation, a coordinated operation to camouflage certain things, to hide information. This is exactly what's going on right now. We also need to take into consideration that there are people implicated in this case that were implicated in the SNC-Lavalin, and I don't think that that's a coincidence. The Canadian Armed Forces institution is problematic, and they're doing what they can to respect the military code, the code of honor. There's often training sessions, courses that are being offered. So when the chiefs of defense staff, the Minister of Defense, and what is the ombudsperson there for? They're an intermediary because, well, they're there to offer advice, and that's what the ombudsperson did in 2018. And the problem is that our minister did not want to see what the ombudsperson was bringing forward. And then the Privy Council, and that's when this organization happened, made it so that the information was not made public and nothing went forward. We're not playing politics here. We're here to protect our civilians and the Canadian Armed Forces. I was a part of that institution for years, and I know how things are on the inside. I know that behaviors have changed over time. So for over 30 years, things have changed. Canadian Armed Forces members want things to work well. But if we look at the higher levels, we look at the Minister of Defense, who does not want to be informed of such a serious situation. That's a problem. If members of the Canadian Armed Forces are denouncing a higher up and they receive threats, that's a serious problem. We can't just reject all this and say it's playing politics. Naming Chief of Defense Staffs, that's politics. We try to talk about the Conservatives who talked about the appointment in 2015. This is public. There was an inquiry at the time. There wasn't enough information to reject General Vance's nomination. But 3 years later, when the current chief of staff is there, there's an ombudsperson that is there to represent military members, speaks to the minister doesn't want to hear what they have to say. Well, that's a serious problem. The minister has to protect its army personnel. It's the same as any other department. A minister of defense has 60,000 people turning towards him as a role model to follow the chain of command, to follow the chief of defense staff. We want information, basic information, so that we can know what to do. And I think that Canadians are asking the same. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. J'aimerais répondre.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to respond to some of my colleagues' comments. Firstly, Mr. Paulus. He mentioned that Canadian Armed Forces members look up to their leaders and the minister, and I agree. I also believe that the Canadian Armed Forces members expects the minister to respect institutions and the procedures in place to protect them. And for an inquiry that protects the victims, it's so important to have that. I think we can all agree on that. The minister wants to be committed, but there's a Privy Council Office inquiry. And if the Canadian Armed Forces knew that there were other inquiries ongoing that could be problematic for confidentiality, and we talked a lot about that today, well, it could say to Canadian Armed Forces members that the process is not independent, that it's not being led by somebody who's responsible for such investigations. So that's what I wanted to say in response to Mr. Paulus. And
Something that Ms. Gallant was talking about, which is the testimony of Mr. Walburn, and how Mr. Walburn was very, I think, and I'm certainly not quoting Ms. Gallant, but said something along the lines, it certainly indicated that Mr. Walburn spoke to the important, that he didn't have the permission of the person bringing forward the allegations to share their identity with the minister when he indicated that he met with the minister. And so I think it's in that particular case, on the one hand, we've been told by, I think we all agree that we need to respect the those people who are coming forward with allegations. I think we all believe that. I think we respect that. We've heard that from witnesses who've come forward who are experts in this area. And Mr. Walburn, as Ms. Gallant said, indicated that he didn't have the permission of the person coming forward to reveal their identity, even to the minister. And so he, on that basis, did not provide when the minister immediately went to the Privy Council's office to ask them to look into the matter, so that could be done in an arm's length way. The ombudsman indicated when contacted by the Privy Council's office that he couldn't share evidence, the evidence needed to initiate an investigation. And so, I think if we believe that the wishes of the person coming forward need to be respected, and we cite Mr. Walburn as an example of respecting the wishes of someone coming forward, then I think we also need to do that. And I think what the concern I have is that that's part of the problem with this motion, is that we haven't made sure that we have the permission of the people who are implicated, who have brought information forward, made allegations, I should say. That's what I'm trying to say. People who've made allegations, that they have not given us their consent. And so if we're on the one hand going to say that Mr. Walburn, if he wasn't given consent by the person bringing allegations, should not share the identity of that individual bringing forward allegations, then I think we have to live by that same principle. And I think what we don't know what's in this mass of documents that would be pulled together through this motion. But I think what we, even if names, and I think Ms. Gallant indicated that that the Liberals on this committee believe, or that based on our arguments, that we believe that the names of people who've come forward are being shared in these communications. I have no idea what's in those communications, but what we do know is that the identity of a person can be ascertained in many different ways. It doesn't require their name to be written, first name, last name, on a piece of paper. It can be done through a whole range of information put together. And I think what we have to be very sensitive to is that. And so I think any communication that involves any information about these cases is the specific allegations, especially, and timing and the context and all those sorts of things. They put people who've come forward at risk for those reasons. So that's why I think this particular motion poses a tremendous amount of risk to the people who brought forward allegations. And I think it's also dangerous for people in the future who may want to bring forward, or it signals certainly that their information could be used could be discovered through a process through a motion, if passed, like the one that we have before us here today. So I wanted to respond to those points, but I also wanted to make that case. It's exactly because of that respect for the wishes of the person coming forward that Ms. Gallant cited, Mr. Walburn citing, that we should also do the same. And therefore, I think these documents risk exposing those individuals who bravely come forward, and we should make sure we shouldn't take that risk. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Baker. Mr. Spengeman, please.
Madam Chair, thank you once again. And I think just bears repeating, a number of my colleagues have made the point, but just to put a bit sharper point on it, that the ombudsperson really made a choice. He made the choice to bring confidential and unactionable information to a political office instead of sending it to the Sexual Misconduct Response Center or the Provost Marshal. And he had the procedures available to him. He chose not to use them and instead brought it to the minister. And he himself told us that he was looking for political top cover. Taking it to the minister made it political, and the minister knew that it should not be political and was very clear on that. And he also knew that he cannot make a decision based on unsubstantiated and non-existent claims. And Madam Chair, I've made reference to the minister's position a couple of times in previous interventions, and the committee has asked him to come back, and he has agreed to come back. And I just wanted to put before the committee once again the position of openness that he has taken in his remarks before the committee last time, and with which he comes to us whenever we hear from him next. The minister said, "I'm deeply troubled that members of the Canadian Forces have felt that trust has been broken and that people believe they could not come forward. No matter the rank, no matter the position, sexual misconduct and harassment is not acceptable. We want it reported, we want it investigated, We want to support those impacted. Eliminating sexual misconduct and creating a safe work environment for everyone in the defense team has been one of my top priorities as the Minister of National Defense. We have more work to do to ensure that any member of the Canadian Armed Forces or civilian in the Department of National Defense feel able to come forward with complaints without fear of any sort of reprisal. I also want to recognize the women who have come forward with these allegations. We are offering all available resources to them to help support them through this difficult time. Ensuring their well-being must be our focus. We recognize how difficult it can be to bring forward allegations, and we must do more to eliminate barriers that prevent people from reporting. I treat all allegations of inappropriate behavior, harassment, or sexual misconduct with the utmost seriousness. I can assure this committee and all Canadians that any allegations that were brought forward were aggressively and very quickly put forward to the proper authorities. All of the proper processes were followed. I, along with the defense team, will continue ensuring that the recent allegations are addressed through the proper authorities. We will have a thorough and deep independent investigation separate from the chain of command. You want answers, Canadians want answers, and I want answers. But most importantly, those who step forward with allegations deserve answers. That, Madam Chair, is the mindset with which the Minister of National Defence has spoken to us when he appeared before committee. That is the mindset with which he will reappear to answer questions that matter to all members of this committee, questions that matter to Canadians. That is the right direction forward, in my view. It is not to take a conjecture of a cover-up and to engage in a massive fishing expedition on all kinds of documents, emails, texts, and reports, none of which at the moment are grounded in fact and on pure speculation jeopardize the risk of this particular complainant's name being disclosed directly or indirectly when we actually have the minister in front of us who can give us directions, when we have officials and witnesses in front of us who can give us direction. That would be the right time to ask specific questions, to ask for documents if relevant, and to come to conclusions, hopefully, Madam Chair, once again, that will take the committee forward into a constructive direction, at the end of which Canadians can regain trust in the Canadian Armed Forces. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, we have Mr. Rubio and then Madame Vandemel.
Microphone, please. If the interpreter cannot hear what is being said.
So,
Okay, stand by, please. Yves, Monsieur Robillard, your microphone doesn't seem to be working well.
Sorry. That better?
Oui, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je m'excuse auprès du comité. Si le Conseil...
My apologies. If the Privy Council has examined the issue and determined that it cannot go any further and that no further action is possible due to confidentiality issues required by the complainant's desire for anonymity, then the Ombudsman only followed the Privy Council's recommendations. The Privy Council is charged with mandating following this issue. Why did the Prime Minister's office not respect this decision?
I think we're over to Madame Vandenbeld now, and then afterwards, Mr. Bagnall.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I would like to put an amendment to the motion that we are debating right now. We at the end of the first sentence, so there's about 4 lines in the first sentence, and then when it says allegations against General Vance in March 2018, the period of April 1st to May 31st, 2019 inclusive, I would add the words and 2015. And then it's between, and you have A through G. I would add H, Ray Novak and PCO, I, Garrett Newout and PCO, J, Garrett Newout and Ray Novak, K, former Minister of National Defense Jason Kenney or his Deputy Minister and the Privy Council Office. And the rest of the motion would remain the same.
All right, do we need... We're just going to suspend for a few minutes here while we get that amendment. Thank you. You please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And it was pointed out to me that there was no timeline in terms of months when I said 2015. So with the committee's permission, I would like to withdraw the motion and resubmit the same motion with and January to August 2015 inclusive. So just to be clear, the only change is instead of saying in 2015, which would presumably be the whole year, I am saying January to August 2015. Is that okay?
Does anybody disagree with that? Okay, no. Okay, good. Thank you very much for the cooperation. So we have a finalized amendment now? All right. So go ahead, Mr. Bizan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just say that on the amendment, I think that, it's important from that idea of process and what was used for vetting, but I will just say that, I know the Liberals are trying to say that this should have been discovered beforehand, but we know that these allegations never came to light till 2018. So to try to go back into 2015 and look at the vetting process at that point in time over allegations that weren't even known back in 2015. So I think it's a wild goose chase. I don't think that you're going to find anything there, but at the same time, we don't have anything to hide. We're expecting this. Unlike what we've seen, and it's filibuster and people are concerned and cover-ups and things like that. I just would say that we want to get this motion passed, the papers produced, and it's just kind of interesting to hear Liberals at committee were saying that we're going to expose the victims here. Not at all. Producing these papers, going through the law clerk to preserve the integrity of those investigations and protect those victims is a way that we are going to be able to ensure that this is a process that is respectful, and that all of us can have confidence in, Madam Chair, that this would provide the information we need to make the changes that are required. And, and it does go to the very top. It goes right into the minister and the minister's office on how these allegations were handled when they were brought before him. And we all know that Gary Walborn, the former ombudsman, had not provided the hard evidence in physical or electronic manner to the minister. So all we're talking about is conversations that happen between officials, and ultimately at the end of the day, we'll be able to have a better picture on what went wrong.
All right, thank you, Mr. Bazan. So we will take, unless there is unanimous consent, probably not. So let's just take a recorded division on the amendment, please.
Moved by Ms. Vandenbel. Mr. Bagnall.
Could you repeat that, Mr. Bagnall, please?
Sorry, I didn't have my earphone on. In favor. In favor.
Mr. Baker.
In favor.
Monsieur Robillard.
In favor. Rule.
Mr. Sprangman.
In favor.
Ms. Vandenbel.
In favor.
Mr. Benson.
In favor.
Mr. Bazan. Mr. Dowdell.
In favor.
Monsieur Paulu.
Pour.
Monsieur Brunel-Duceppe.
Pour.
Mr. Garrison.
In favor.
All right, thank you. The amendment passes now on to a recorded division on the main motion.
As amended.
As amended.
Mr. Bagnall.
In favor.
Mr. Baker.
In favor.
Monsieur Robillard.
In favor.
Mr. Spankerman,
In favor.
Vandenbell,
In favor.
Mr. Benson,
In favor.
Mr. Bazan,
Yes.
Mr. Dowdell,
In favor.
Mr. Paulu,
For.
Mr. Brunel Duceppe,
For.
Mr. Garrison.
In favor.
The amended motion is carried. All right, thank you, anyone. Any further business, or can we adjourn? All right, thank you, everyone. We'll talk soon.